All right, our final session for the conference is about to begin, and I'm handing over the keys to Father Mark Michael, who's the rector of St. Francis Episcopal Church in Potomac, Maryland.
Good afternoon. Welcome to our final session, where I think we'll be exploring some solutions or some potential solutions to the problem of polarization, using some of the deep resources of our faith tradition and cultural tradition within Anglicanism. The first speaker is Abigail Cutter, Assistant Professor of Theology at King College in Bristol, Tennessee. Abigail previously taught at Southwestern College, earned her doctorate at Southern Methodist University, and her research interests are in political theology, Judaism and Christianity, and the Sabbath. I know Abigail through her long connection to the ministry of the Living Church. I serve as the editor of the Living Church and assist in other areas of our life, and Abigail has been part of our writing team for, I don't know, a decade maybe longer. Okay, since 2016, and has written many wonderful articles for us, including one on Covenant, the weblog of the Living Church published last week that I think closely relates to the topic she'll be speaking about this afternoon. The title of her lecture is Remembering Our Place, How the Anglican Parish and Diocese Call Us Back to Home, Earth, and Neighbor. Let's welcome Abigail Cutter.
Thank you all. I'm delighted to be here. Keep myself accountable. A little timer going on there. All right. So insider-outsider divisions are very old, but they've been organized differently around shifting sources of identity at different moments in history. Because today, like Sheree Harder said yesterday, we're plagued by an epidemic of loneliness. A sentimental person might think the historically tight-knit English parish is the solution to this problem, like my title might suggest. But we can't be too hasty about this. It's important to recognize that the parish, which was the dominant unit of both local church life and secular administration from the Middle Ages all the way until the early 20th century, was itself often embroiled in heated conflict between insiders and outsiders. From at least the 17th to the 19th centuries, neighboring parishes were regularly pitted against each other in legal disputes over parish boundaries and over which poor people could gain settlements. Ruffians and neighboring communities saw the parish bounds as the dividing line between them, giving a hard time to anyone who wanted to come courting in a parish not his own, and often showing up at each other's parties expressly to cause trouble. John Wesley himself witnessed some of these inter-parish battles, especially between the parishes of Walsall and Darlaston, while he was on his preaching journeys which sparked a movement outside the parish system, I might add. In protest against these deep-rooted local attachments, Wesley famously declared, "I look upon the world as my parish." On the basis of just this very quick description that I've given of the narrowness that parish identity could engender, it may be easy for us today to line up behind Wesley's sentiment. After all, isn't provincial or parochial narrowness something to rise above? When we become more globally minded, don't we become more tolerant of diversity, humbler about our own views and preferences, more willing to love and care for those in need? Don't we? Today, more and more of us could say with Wesley, "The world is my parish." Not only is it descriptively true that a growing number of us move globally, do business globally, build relationships that are not defined by space, and participate in ephemeral communities defined by shared lifestyle identities or social media space, rather than by our common life in a single geographic place. But to call oneself a global citizen is also aspirational, attended with a degree of glamour. The rise above local prejudices, however, hasn't created the unity that thinkers from Adam Smith to Karl Marx to Woodrow Wilson had hoped. Rather, here we are discussing the painful problems caused by a new kind of social division. In this pattern of insider-outsider animosity, someone from Los Angeles can feel a kinship with someone from Vermont whom she's never met in response to a meme that she thinks brilliantly describes the social ills of the moment, while feeling revulsion toward her neighbors because of a flag they have hung out on their porch. When I describe this slightly absurd situation, I hope you don't hear condescension in my tone either. This woman has very little preventing her from sinking into disgust when she sees her neighbor's flag. She may recognize that flag as a symbol of disrespect for something she holds dear. Furthermore, there's little chance she has any reason to identify with her neighbors or they with her. They have kids, she doesn't. They belong to one religious group, she belongs to a different one. Both households do their business online, so they rarely run into each other in public. They all get around by car anyway. Even if she wanted to organize a block party to get to know them better, few people would take the time to join in, since her neighbors, like average Americans, are each working a full month more per year than their counterparts did 35 years ago. For this woman, the most reliable way she can find others with whom to engage is through online groups and forums. This kind of division is yet one more symptom of the isolation that many people on both right and left are grieving. For all kinds of reasons, while we may admire global citizenship, we are suffering from a loss of a meaningful sense of local community, or being bound up with our neighbors in a common life. But we don't account for it in the same way. For many conservatives, loss of a sense of community can be attributed to socialist ideologies and their tendencies towards centralized resource management and a loss of local autonomy. For many progressives, loss of a sense of community can be attributed to the ability of large corporations to outcompete local economies and break up a shared communitarian responsibility, and then the concomitant lack of the political will on the part of the rest of us to band together to prevent it. What both narratives fail to take seriously enough, I think, is the ineluctable tendency of all efficient technologies and human behaviors, what Jacques Ellul called technique, towards centralization and homogenization. Ellul thinks, at least, that big government and big business, rather than either one of them being the primary driver, are simply the inevitable forms in which the uniformity of technique is being realized. But there are many more reasons we could cite, which I won't detail. Historian K.D.M. Snell, after listing many factors contributing to the shift away from the local, sums it up: power has gone into hiding. The point of my talk here is not to uncover all the sources of loneliness and loss of local community. What interests me is that first, there is a shared grief here. Second, that rather than addressing the grief together, the parties parties and partisans are using this grief as an opportunity to further vilify the other, making it less likely that we will turn to each other for recovery. And third, the ironic fact is that when sociologists study the interventions that attempt to mitigate polarization and have some degree of success, what we find are tactics that most closely mimic features of the thick local communities that have been lost. Let me explain. Because polarization is a phenomenon that's been studied for decades now, with increasing interest in the last decade or so, a number of organizations have been developing more and more techniques to combat it. And enough of these efforts have been in play that social scientists have gotten in on the business to study which ones work and which ones don't, or even backfire. Interventions that are typically found to be successful in reducing polarization have a few things in common. Think of the acronym TRI, T-R-I, thoughts, relationships, and institutions. In the realm of thoughts, interventions are successful when they correct inaccurate beliefs about participants' political opponents. This is so important because we tend to believe, and this is demonstrated, we tend to believe that our political opponents are significantly more radical than they are, or that they more widely hold characteristics we find unlikable. And then the more extreme we believe our opponents to be, rightly or wrongly, the more extreme we tend to become ourselves in response. So correcting inaccurate perceptions in a timely manner is quite important to short-circuit what could otherwise become a self-fulfilling prophecy. In the realm of relationships, interventions must provide opportunities for opponents to recognize things we have in common, at bottom to recognize our shared humanity. This might take the shape of learning about the web of family connections our political opponents have, but it can include other things as well. You play the cello, you read graphic novels, me too. It's important that we have the opportunity to see things that humanize our opponents, because dehumanizing the other is the quickest way to mistreating them, to advocating stripping our opponent's civil rights, or even to be undisturbed by the idea of their death. On the level of institutions, successful interventions create structures for interaction that highlight good behavior, moderate views, and shared humanity over hostile behavior, extreme views, and partisan stereotypes. This is connected to the reasons that Jonathan Rauch, in his book, The Defense of Truth, celebrates how important it is to have thriving universities, peer-reviewed journals, and mainstream journalistic practices. A Wild West marketplace of ideas is not sufficient to guarantee that truth will be ascendant, because many other things are more marketable than truth. Rauch is worried about social media platforms not for all the reasons for which they're often criticized, but specifically because they tend to be unmoderated, allowing the loudest voice often more attention than the most careful or qualified. So we need strong institutions to privilege the careful pursuit of truth. Essential Partners is an organization that I've interacted with and learned quite a bit from, that is focused on depolarizing difficult topics and making hard conversations possible in classrooms. Well, what they do is right along these lines. They teach techniques for structured dialogue. These techniques include careful preparation, very well-trained moderators, carefully crafted questions, communication agreements on the part of participants, time for reflection, and timed speaking distributed among participants. In no way are these dialogues a free-for-all, but they're so important in the most polarizing situations because they're structured to specifically highlight all participants' shared humanity, to give a voice to moderates and everyone who might otherwise be left out of the conversation, to correct misperceptions, and this is important, to create a space where everyone can enter the conversation as gently as possible. Now, the idea of safe spaces has gotten a bad rap for some good reasons, but consider this: it may be necessary to curate difficult conversations, particularly in the most heated situations, so that people don't feel under threat. Because we know that when people feel under threat and their fight or flight instincts are triggered, that is not a time when they will be willing to consider complexity, show their own vulnerable side, or be open to the wobbly experience of learning something new. And remember why that is so problematic. If people feel so threatened, they can't show their human side, the things they love, the things about which they feel conflicted, then opponents remain at risk of dehumanizing each other. You may have noticed, and if you haven't, we can pull out studies to observe this, that all these features of complex interaction are best achieved locally and in an unmediated context. So in this very particular context of polarization, where we are not divided by locality as much, we are divided by locality, but not as much as by nationwide and often abstract ideologies. In this context, I believe we would do well to recover a sense of local identity like Anglicans have experienced in the English parish. English Christianity has long had a strong gift for appreciating the local. Now, the value for the local church goes back to the very beginning of Christianity, when, of course, the local church was the expression of the one Catholic Church, the whole church gathered in that one place. As Michael Ramsey explains in The Gospel in the Catholic Church, bishops, as the overseers of a local church, represented the Catholic Church to the local church, but also represented the local church when the bishops gathered in fellowship and mutual recognition. So to pastor Christ's one holy Catholic Church has always required attentiveness to the particular idiosyncrasies of a local community. In English Christianity, then, this recognition of the local became particularly granular as missionary activity took root along the territorial lines of existing secular authorities. Minsters, or the centers of missionary expansion, starting in the 7th century, arose with dependent field churches springing up around them. And then over time, a wider pattern arose where Anglo-Saxon thanes would establish churches on their lands, which would be supported by the produce of the lands and would serve the common people working them. Both these patterns of church founding were distinctly attentive to the land itself. And one reason why this had to be is because tithes were assessed based on the produce of the land, not per head. So it was very important then that parish boundaries be very, very well known. And the beating of the bounds became a persistent tradition where the parishioners would go out and walk the entire bounds around the parish and hitting the boundary markers with a stick, especially on Rogation Day. Over time, though, the parish also became the chief unit of local secular administration, including the upkeep of roads and especially the relief of the poor. From about 1572 onward, it was enshrined in law that poor relief was the duty of the parish. And then in 1662, the Poor Relief Act, or the Settlement Act, had to then come in to determine which poor people belonged to which parish. And so parishes were sometimes, not saintly about this, and were fighting about, trying to reduce opportunities for people to gain settlement in their parish. But despite this, the poor took great pride in their settlement as their right and often went to great pains to highlight their parish identity. And then the poor who were well established in a parish were often closely bonded to the better off people who around this shared sense of belonging. Now, there have been lots of critics of this pattern of poor relief. Adam Smith, for one, complained that it limited the mobility of the poor to be able to follow the market. Others have talked about it as a paternalistic practice that limited the agency of the poor. And in many cases, this is true. But in retrospect, there are also historian Snell of Parish and Belonging comments that it actually provided quite a lot of freedom for people to move for work, knowing that they would always have the security of returning home to their own parish. And it's the parish bounds that became the chief unit of belonging, or when they would write to each other about, I'm worried about my financial situation, they would always be referencing home or belonging around the unit of the parish, specifically because of this settlement law. So I won't go into too much detail about how this administration changed throughout the 19th century, but all the way up until the 1920s, parishes were really important in the administration of poor relief. And then finally, in 1948, the National Assistance Act created, in effect, a national settlement so that everyone had a right to poor relief no matter where they were, removing the parish from its administration. But this is a quick summary so you can understand now why the parish was so important for secular reasons and why it played such a strong role in English people's sense of social belonging. But Andrew Rumsey has recently explained why the parish should be seen as a symbol of an Anglican theology of place. Those with any background in theology here will be accustomed to thinkers pointing out how Christ's incarnation represents God's entry into time, which transforms and sanctifies human history. We can thus inhabit sacred times in our liturgies, our feasts, and our fasts. What fewer people point out, though some do, like Karl Barth, not an Anglican, is to observe the same thing about physical space. When God enters the world, occupying space in his very body, he changes what it means to live in the physical world. We can inhabit sacred spaces because Jesus is the one place in which God and humanity, indeed God and all material creation, are at one. And when we participate in the Eucharist, we join Christ in that space. And the specificity of the church's place matters deeply because the Eucharist is never celebrated in the abstract. It's always on this altar, just as Jesus took up and gave for us one body in one place. And the background to Jesus' incarnation matters too, because the land of Israel had long served as the symbol of the longing of God's people to be at one with God. But the memory of Abraham's wandering combined with the persistence of exile meant that the land was hardly something that could be possessed with any finality on human terms. For the church, too, we would risk this worldly possessiveness about our places. It's only Christ and our eschatological hope that can keep us either from a Gnostic placelessness on the one hand, or the idolatry of place and control of our territory on the other. What's so important for Rumsey about the parish system is how it has provided a suitable setting for the established Church of England to serve all within its bounds, a bit like Dr. Walker narrated for us yesterday. Not only have parish priests been entrusted with the care of the souls of all people in their parishes, Anglican or increasingly not, but they have also tended to have a heightened awareness of the natural ecology of their parish. Parish means the entire place, humans, living things, and the land. I think of the characteristically Anglican words of Isaac Watts's hymn, Joy to the World. Let earth receive her king, let heaven and nature sing, let fields and flocks, floods, rocks, hills, and plains repeat the sounding joy. No more let thorns infest the ground. He comes to make his blessings flow far as the curse is found. Whether or not fields, floods, and rocks or people consciously realize it, Jesus' coming is good news for them. And Anglican ministry has meant lifting up all these things to God, like the original priestly work of Adam. Ben Quash has reflected on this priestly vocation within Anglicanism as the task of seeing and naming things truly. He compares the work of a priest to that of a social anthropologist who is not there to change the situation, but to know it well enough to describe it very well. He says that while the national headlines can give a pretty dismal impression that nobody cares about the church anymore, the church is very unpopular, local headlines tell a very different story. Churches and priests partner with charities, schools, and other organizations. After a tragedy, the priest is often the one asked to comment on the community's frame of mind. While Quash compares the priest to a social scientist, I want to compare the church perhaps to a spiritual director or even a confessor serving the community itself. These roles highlight the ministry of presence, attention, listening, and then speaking back the truth in the presence of God. This combination of meanings of the parish has inspired Mark Clavier to undertake a project called Convivium at Brecon Cathedral in Wales, and its parish church, St. Mary's, where he now serves. Convivium's tagline is living well with God, creation, and each other. Clavier, who's from the US but has long been serving as a priest in the Church of England, recognized in Wales a profound distinctiveness of place that has been preserved much more than he had experienced in the US. But he also realized that this was at risk because the appreciation for place was disappearing too among the people who lived there and in England. So when Clavier would, for instance, visit the Lake District and remark to an English vacationer about the unique riches of the Lake District, the Englishman would shrug off the Lake District and instead sing the praises of Las Vegas. Convivium then has been an effort to help residents of Brecon celebrate and preserve their local identity, including local economy, history, and ecology, and the specific importance of these things before God. Convivium has hosted conferences reflecting on theology and place, festivals that feature local artists, food, charities, and history walks, and retreats that include prayer and nature walks. Out of this endeavor has come collaborations across the parish, a community garden now independently run by an organization serving those with intellectual disabilities, and a history walk that is perpetually available with signposts around the cathedral. Clavier has reflected on the fact that even though Anglicanism's status in England and Wales is on the decline and must behave more and more as one option among many, as the parish priest, he's still seen as a public figure in a way that we in North America can hardly understand. He's been met with a surprising amount of goodwill from local groups with whom he would like to collaborate. Anglicanism outside England and Wales, however, differs by being neither established nor organized in bounded parishes. two connected features, obviously. We do, however, still retain a diocesan structure headed by bishops, after which the Episcopal Church is named. So even though the history of the United States and the Episcopal Church don't have nearly the legacy of granular attachment to specific places that Anglicans in Britain do, we can't escape attending to the territory we occupy. Furthermore, we haven't experienced the dramatic centralization of the apostolic authority like the Roman Catholic Church has. So whereas English priests, especially in rural areas, have had to, in the past at least, know their land in great detail, it is bishops in other places who typically must do the same, but on a larger scale. Bishop John Bowerschmidt of Tennessee has reflected on how his episcopal ministry has given him a greater appreciation for the locatedness in space of his churches than he had ever had to develop as a parish priest. In my diocese, he says, the directional affirmation, "turn right at Bucksnort," is essential information for the bishop, the sort that captures the incarnational and concrete nature of this ministry and its rootedness in place. Bishop Kathleen Bascom of Kansas has made the specificity of Kansas a major focus of her ministry. The Bethany Gardens and Conference Center have been designed with great care to acknowledge local ecology, whether prairie or agricultural, local history, whether indigenous or white or black, and those who live in the inner city neighborhood now around the diocesan center, whatever their religious affiliation. While building and designing the gardens, diocesan staff have built partnerships with local schools, politicians, neighbors, many funding organizations, other churches, and a sister organization in Kenya. Not only does the garden site host prayer, meditation, gardening and nutrition lessons, and the life cycles of monarch butterflies, but it is also becoming a place for people to resolve their differences. A council circle is being used in the mediation work of the neighboring public school, and a retreat center on the property hosts community dinners where intentional conversation takes place across difference. All these components of the Bethany Gardens project might seem like they're disparate, trying to hold too many things together, but I don't think so. On the contrary, the through line is that Bishop Bascom sees the church as carrying out a priestly ministry for all the people, indeed all creation, by seeing and describing what is true there and lifting it to God. So what do I think it would be like for an Anglican sense of consecrated space to be brought to bear on the public situation of division in our public discourse? In the first place, churches must see themselves as being for others, not insular. To do this, churches have to rediscover a Christology that helps root them not only as a set-apart people, but as a people set apart for a priestly purpose, with a calling to serve the whole parish, human community, and non-human creation. We could do this through evangelism, which we can sometimes forget, but also through bringing the offerings of the people and the prayers of the people. Not just money, but what is it in this particular place? What characterizes the local economy? What are the gifts? What are the particular charisms of this place that we can bring up to the altar? And then when we offer the prayers of the people, we can be attentive not only to the congregation, but to the surrounding territory. Next, the church should become a people who pay attention well enough to speak the truth about a particular place, and then make spaces for the people there to see themselves and each other more truly. Perhaps community art projects, perhaps history tours, perhaps walks through the natural ecology, tours of important economic sites, and then perhaps also, like in the Diocesan Center of Topeka, spaces where carefully designed dialogue is possible. What is the role of secular leaders in this? Do I think that any features of a parish theology of place can be extracted from the church and reproduced in another context, as if the Anglican heritage is simply an example that could be mimicked elsewhere? Well, I think that Rumsey is right, actually, about how important a Christology is, that Jesus is the only place in whom God and creation come together in a non-competitive way. And it's so important to look forward to the eschatological fulfillment rather than a controlling present possession. So I worry that if we try to focus on locality apart from Christ, we'll be re-entrenched in this place as the end-all, be-all, with a triumphalist focus on those who are from here or not from here. It can be very hard to hold together the particularity of place with the universal offering of God. This is why I think it is a unique offering of the structure of the Catholic Church in its Anglican form that can provide this gift. But what can secular leaders do in this? Well, I'm with Oliver O'Donovan. They can have an appropriate recognition of their own limited ability. O'Donovan, in The Desire of the Nations, he says that the calling of earthly rulers in deference to Christ is to acknowledge their limits. This is not the same as a conservative call for the federal government to be humbler and leave more things to local and state governments. Rather, it is a call for those who govern, including and perhaps especially Christians, to acknowledge that they are merely placeholders, while they also take seriously the call to hold places in sacred trust. Because while we need the government to enact an authority in specific places, it is Christ who rightly makes heaven and nature sing, and in whom people can be reconciled to each other and God. So let earth receive her King. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Abigail, for that very stimulating talk. This discussion of beating the bounds made me think of a service that I think Marcus attended with me, beating the bounds of the parish of St. Michael in the Corn Market in Oxford. If you ever happen to be in Oxford on Rogation Day, it's one of the most eccentric services you may have the privilege of participating in. But anyway, moving on to other topics. Dr. Nicholas Norman Krauss will present our final paper. He's a postdoctoral research associate at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. He earned his doctorate in political theology and the conflicts of democracy. That was the topic of the thesis, and is taught at Baylor as well as at the George W. Truett Theological Seminary in Waco. He's also a priest of the Anglican Diocese of the Gulf Atlantic. The topic of his talk is covenantal pluralism and the goods of conflict. Let's welcome Dr. Norman Krauss.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Ryan and the John Wesley Institute, and for you all for your patience and long-suffering through one more paper. I'll try to close this out well here. What I'm going to try to do is track a kind of history of a concept. And the concept is, I'm going to call covenantal pluralism. And I'm going to give a kind of cursory reading of a number of figures and movements that you may not be familiar with, and so I'm happy in the Q&A to touch on any of them in particular with further detail. But really what this is kind of a history of two concepts that finally in more recent times have come together. So several years ago, the Templeton Religion Trust launched a new initiative called covenantal pluralism. What if religions engaged one another across their deepest differences? The initiative asked. And drawing on the concept of covenant, the project has tried to reframe the religious, moral, and cultural diversity characteristic of modern societies beyond paradigms of tolerance, instead proposing forms of relationship and trust building across deep difference. Covenant, the project maintains, evokes an easily understood holistic vision that emphasizes relationships sustained by trust, wherein difference is respected but also directly engaged, even contested. Covenantal pluralism is about both, they say, quote, top-down legal and policy parameters like freedom of religion, constitutional protections for minorities, etc., as well as bottom-up cultural norms and practices like respect, religious literacy, virtues like humility, patience, fairness, reciprocity, cooperativeness, and self-critique. Now, covenant, in other words, establishes relationships of trust and commitment, sometimes formal, sometimes informal, wherein difference can be engaged instead of simply tolerated. So the project calls to mind, I think at least for those familiar with the history and polity of the Anglican Communion, the failed Anglican Covenant of the late 2000s. Like the Templeton Initiative, the Anglican Covenant drew on the concept of covenant to develop a formal mechanism in order to maintain or try to maintain unity and mutuality across deep difference. So in this presentation, I want to consider the history of covenantal pluralism in Anglican political thought in order to propose a kind of revised version of it for our contemporary moment, characterized as it is by intense conflict and polarization. So where does the notion of covenant as a way of encompassing difference come from? Is what I want to answer. So after detailing the origins of covenant as a political concept and the development of a school of English political pluralism that's shaped by it, I'll consider two important contemporary inheritors of this tradition, Rowan Williams and Luke Bretherton, who both advance the theory in a decidedly participatory democratic direction. And then finally, I'll attend to what I take to be a kind of significant lacuna in the tradition of covenantal pluralism, which is an account of the goods of conflict, to use Alistair MacIntyre's phrase. And I want to propose that our present political moment might be served, paradoxically perhaps, actually not by lessening conflict, but by intensifying it in productive ways. Healthy conflict, as some social theorists of conflict studies would put it. So, part one, the origins of conflict. So, origins of covenant, Covenant has a long kind of legal history, especially in medieval England. But I want to pick up with the origins of covenant as a distinctly political philosophical concept. And that lies, I think, in Reformed continental thought. So John Calvin explicitly used the language of covenant and covenanting with respect to citizenship, law, and rule in Geneva, thematizing the obligations of magistrate to God and to commonwealth and of citizens to law in terms of covenantal responsibility. Heinrich Bullinger similarly conceptualized the commonwealth as a covenanted community in his influential 1534 work De Testamento. And the federalism of each would be important for the development of neo-Calvinist theories of sphere sovereignty in the 19th and 20th centuries by figures like Abraham Kuyper and Hermann Dooyeweerd. But the critical figure, both for understanding the trajectory of Reformed political thought and the pluralist traditions I want to consider today, is this, I think, criminally neglected but hugely influential German Calvinist Johannes Althusius, 1563 to 1638. And if you've never heard of Althusius, quite all right. He's severely underappreciated. But Althusius's 1603 work, Politica, was quite influential. It developed a sophisticated proto-republican political vision centered on the notion of covenant. And the work's defense of popular sovereignty is set directly against the theories of sovereignty advocated by thinkers like Jean Bodin, but it's equally opposed to theories of popular sovereignty later developed by figures like Rousseau. So in the preface to the first edition of Politica, Althusius argues that the rights of sovereignty, the jura majestatis, belong not to prince or to supreme magistrate, but to the commonwealth or the people. The former, Althusius says, is simply, quote, the steward, administrator, and overseer of these rights, end quote. But their ownership, he says, belongs properly to the people, and importantly, the people as a whole. The analogy that Althusius uses throughout the work is organic, that of a body, the body politic, and the rights of sovereignty are, quote, the vital spirit, soul, and heart and life of the body, end quote, by which the Commonwealth lives. This is so, he goes on, quote, to the extent that even if the people should wish to renounce them, it could no more transfer or alienate them to another than could a man who has life give it to another. They cannot exist except in them, end quote. So the notion of covenant plays a twofold role in Althusius' account of social sovereignty. First, covenant is the means by which the rights of sovereignty are entrusted to the person or persons charged with administering them. So unlike Hobbes, where individual right is renounced or laid down or alienated, those are all terms that he uses, in contracting to authorize the sovereign, Althusius believes that the rights of sovereignty are inalienable. They cannot be alienated. A magistrate then can only be entrusted to administer sovereignty on behalf of the Commonwealth to whom it properly belongs. Now, covenant is important here because precisely of its theological valence. A covenant, as Althusius understands it, is a formal binding of trust and obligation before God. So in his chapters on the constituting of the supreme magistrate in Politica, Althusius writes in great detail about the means by which the magistrate is entrusted with administrative authority, quote, a process by which the people and the supreme magistrate enter into covenant concerning certain laws and conditions that set forth the form and manner of rule and compliance to it. And actually, he details this in a really interesting kind of ritual liturgical enactment that attends to the way in which covenant is a deeply religio-political activity. So thus far, Althusius is making developments internal to the Calvinist tradition he inherits. But where he makes his most lasting mark, I believe, is in a second application of the notion of covenant to his theory of sovereignty, which is this. Covenant applies not just to the relationship between commonwealth and magistrate, but also, and perhaps more importantly, between members of the polity. Politics, says Althusius, quote, is the art of associating, consociandi, people for the purpose of establishing, cultivating, and conserving a common life. The subject matter of politics, he goes on, is therefore association, consociatio, whereby persons, quote, pledge themselves each to the other by explicit or tacit agreement to mutual communication of whatever is useful and necessary for the harmonious exercise of social life, end quote. So associations, that's the heart of politics for Althusius. And associations can either be simple and private, in his words, so family, guild, civic association, or mixed and public, the city, the commonwealth. But in either case, they are formed and sustained by covenant. Pactum is his word. Covenant is, Althusius argues, quote, the efficient cause, in its Aristotelian sense, of association. And it establishes a bond of trust granted and accepted in the communication of mutual aid, counsel, and right or use, end quote. A commonwealth, then, according to Althusius, is nothing other than a network of associations of various scales from family to guild, city to province, all of which are constituted by covenant and exist in covenantal relationship with others. So Althusius' vision is covenantal, then, in the classically reformed sense, commonwealth as covenant community, but it is also fundamentally pluralist in the sense that sovereignty is distributed across a range of associations. And importantly, as Luke Brotherton notes, this pluralism is not simply administrative, but social and political. So unlike, for instance, federalist constitutional arrangements which attempt to limit and constrain governing power while still leaving, as he says, undisturbed the top-down monistic nature of sovereignty, for Althusius, sovereignty is an assemblage arising from the whole or commonweal that is itself constituted from multiple consociations. Okay, so it's this pluralist sensibility of Althusius that I want to kind of attend to now in its history. So part 2, covenantal pluralism in Anglican political thought. So the influence of Althusius's consociational covenantal pluralism on Anglican political thought is significant, but it's indirect. It comes by way of the German scholar Otto von Guercke, 1841 to 1921. Now, I'm not going to say much about Guercke himself for the sake of time, only that he is also one of the most influential legal theorists of the 19th and 20th centuries, but rarely recognized as such in histories of political thought. He's kind of confined as a legal theorist, but he has tremendous effect on the history of political thought, especially in England. His detailed studies of medieval legal and political theory, especially of Althusius, of whom he was the foremost scholar of his day, had tremendous impact on both German and English intellectual life. In 1900, F.W. Maitland published an English translation of Guercke's 4-volume work on the German law of associations under the title Political Theories of the Middle Ages. And the publication was instrumental in the revival of interest in associations among English pluralists, some of whom were Maitland's own students. John Neville Figgis is doubtless the most important of these students, as his work drew on the pluralist state, drew explicitly on Guercke to lay the groundwork of what would become a tradition of English pluralism in the early 20th century, running through figures like G.D.H. Cole and Harold Laski, who I'll turn to in a moment. But first, Figgis. Figgis, an Anglican priest and political philosopher, is often regarded as the father of English pluralism. His 1913 volume, Churches in the Modern State, developed an account of the autonomy of social groups and the integrity of associational forms of life against theories of state sovereignty. As Figgis developed it, pluralism was essentially a theory of distributed sovereignty. First, in that it questioned the prevailing liberal picture of political society as a relationship primarily between individuals and a state, theorized in terms of social contract, and second, in that it questioned the identification of unitary sovereign power with a monist state, even if legitimated by the people. In between state and individuals, and comprising the real heart of political society, were numerous associations, families, churches, schools, trade unions, etc., each with inherent rights, authority, and personality, importantly, personality for Figgis. Now, sovereignty in this view does not rest in the state nor in any single governing institution, but rather emerges from the plurality of associations that comprise political society. The state has an important role to play in this account, but it's not one of exercising sovereign power. Rather, it's administrative. The state is, in Figgis's theory, tasked with ensuring and maintaining a legal order of peace and stability, wherein associations can freely develop and pursue goods in common with others. The state establishes and enforces rules of conduct to protect the autonomy of associations, and it's for this reason that Cecile Laborde refers to Figgis's theory as one of group liberalism. I think is an interesting way of putting it, at least. Figgis's pluralist theory was importantly theological in a way that his successors like Cole and Laski were not. And this is because his political theory was essentially an extension of his ecclesiology. So Figgis did not develop a purely sociological account of the individual group-state relation. Rather, he extended his insights about the social nature of the church, which he saw as the kind of ideal type of association, to a more general theory of human association. Ecclesial association reveals the nature of all associations as not merely contractual but organic, quote, living social unions exceeding the sum of their parts. Moreover, it was a peculiarly Anglican and Anglo-Catholic ecclesiology that informed this political vision. The church, as the mystical body of Christ, was constituted by members' covenantal union with one another and Christ in baptism. Thus, Figgis opposed both Romanist ecclesiologies that centralized ecclesiastical power in the papacy, saw this as just another form of absolute sovereignty, but also Protestant theologies that understood the church to be more or less a voluntary association, quote, analogous to the joint stock company, an association formed purely at will and united by no bonds but those of contract, end quote. The church, in Figes's vision, is an organic association, lacking a central source of ecclesiastical authority, such belongs only to Christ, but possessing distributed authority, quote, a balanced constitution, as he puts it, shared by councils, bishops, parishes, provinces, clergy, laity, etc. Inspired as he was by the conciliarist movements of the 14th and 15th centuries and the development of Anglican ecclesiology in the post-Reformation period, Figes believed, quote, real authority is that which exists diffusively in the whole communitas fidelium. The authority of the church, he goes on, is not an abstract doctrine deduced from the notion of unity, but is a synthesis of all the living parts of the church, end quote. In other words, authority is distributed and plural, and yet bounded in covenantal union. We might say bonds of communion or bonds of affection. And that is its Catholicity. And so with politics. Now, Figes was a conservative Whig, and his pluralist vision was organicist, aristocratic, hierarchical, anti-statist, and anxious about democracy. But it inspired, nevertheless, a generation of radicals who, like Figes, also wanted to reclaim the integrity of associations against the encroachment of the state. I'm thinking of guild socialists like G.D.H. Cole and Harold Laski, who applied Figes's associational theory and were quite willing to name him as their primary influence in doing so, but applying it to labor and industrial relations, defending the rights of trade unions against both state and capital to organize and direct productive activity and industry in a democratic and participatory manner. Now, Cole and Laski were not themselves particularly religiously inclined, though they did have a deep appreciation for religious communities and the role of religion in social life. So the covenantal structure of Figes's thought, inherited from Gierke and Althusius, it kind of recedes with Cole and Laski, and yet their extension of his pluralism is significant. So I want to say a couple things about that. First, Cole. Cole, the more radical of the two thinkers, took up Figes's associationalism in order to defend a democratic socialism of worker-directed planning and enterprise. Following Figes, Cole argued that associations, the real heart of political society between individuals and the state, have rights to autonomous development and agency. Where he pushed beyond Figes was in applying this directly to political economy. So against what he saw as both the anti-democratic control of production and distribution by capital and markets, as well as the anti-democratic statism of Fabianism and Soviet communism, Cole articulated a radically democratic form of worker democracy. National guilds, rather than private capital or the state, would be the agents of economic determination, working cooperatively in a federation of labor unions and associations under the administration of the state. Now, Laski, on the other hand, more the theorist than the activist, devoted himself, especially early in his career, to applying Figes's pluralism to the question of sovereignty, in particular, the nature of the state and the legitimacy of political authority. Like Figes, he believed the notion of absolute sovereignty to be a fiction, both historically and theoretically. Instead, sovereignty was a dispersed reality, shared and contested by the numerous overlapping associational forms of society. Moreover, Laski advanced a political sociology attentive to the inevitability of conflict between groups in society, making the idea of a general will impossible, a fiction at least. So against traditional theories of representative democracy, he developed a theory of functional representation, wherein, for instance, industrial constituencies were given a voice alongside territorial ones. As he kind of famously put it, anyone can see that the railways are as real as Lancashire. and should be treated politically as such. Now finally, though both Cole and Lasky did not theorize guild socialism anything like theological or religious terms, Cole's associate and companion Maurice Reckitt did, joining Cole's socialist pluralism to an Anglo-Catholic theology and social thought in numerous books and essays throughout the 1930s and 40s, and his leadership of institutions like the Church Socialist League and publications like the newspaper The Church Socialist and the journal Christendom. Reckitt, one of the leading Christian socialists of his day, joined Figgis and Cole's emphasis on associations to an Anglo-Catholic sacramental vision and ecclesiology and theology of the Incarnation, proposing a kind of sacramental socialism, as one scholar puts it, alongside Cole's work on guilt, who he worked very closely with. So Figgis's pluralism had a tremendous effect on 20th century political thought, including not only these figures, Cole, Lasky, and Reckitt, but also Anglican thinkers like R.H. Tawney, as was mentioned, Charles Gore, as well as important Christian socialist institutions like the Christian Social Union and the Church Socialist League. Okay, covenantal pluralism today. So today, I think two figures stand out as clear heirs to this English pluralist tradition. And that's Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, and Luke Bretherton. It's important to note that Williams and Bretherton, who have each written much on pluralism, approach pluralism not simply as a matter of distributed sovereignty across multiple forms of association and group. They're also particularly concerned with the moral and cultural and religious diversity of those groups. In other words, their innovation is to attend to the value pluralism, now constitutive of the social and political pluralism that earlier pluralists described. So Figgis, for instance, would not have countenanced such value pluralism as possible for the kind of pluralist society he envisioned, one which resembled the medieval order, in which a plurality of institutions were held together by a shared ethical vision embodied in the Catholic Church. But Williams and Bretherton are concerned with thematizing value pluralism and Christian political participation in pluralist politics in theologically meaningful ways. So their contribution is to extend the pluralist insights by addressing the central conundrum of contemporary democratic life, namely, how to achieve a just common life amidst deep difference, and especially more recently, polarized difference. Now, Williams does this by proposing what he calls interactive pluralism. So following Figgis and other pluralists, he argues that first-level associations, quote, guilds, unions, churches, ethnic groups, all sorts of civil associations, have a natural liberty to exist and organize themselves, and the state's role is to harmonize and to some degree regulate this social variety. It's that pluralist sensibility that he inherits from people like Figgis that was behind his controversial suggestion in 2008 that British law might recognize and make room for certain practices of Sharia law. You might remember this controversy for a moment in 2008. Where he goes beyond earlier pluralists is in emphasizing the state's responsibility not just to establish a legal order of stability in which associations can flourish, but also to facilitate their democratic engagement with one another in deliberative practices to shape policy. So he contrasts his interactive pluralism with forms of multiculturalism, or what he calls static pluralism, that are aimed at simply peaceful coexistence. Williams argues for the importance of forms of public exchange, even public conflict, where persons and communities register, quote, the most significant motivating elements in their convictions about human dignity and destiny, end quote, in arguments and contestation over policies and political goods. Rather than simply a theory of distributed sovereignty, pluralism for Williams is a theory of radical and post-secular democracy, wherein the very conflict amidst difference that liberal multiculturalism seeks to preempt actually becomes the real substance of democratic deliberation. Then Bretherton's work on religious communities and practices of grassroots democracy can be seen as a kind of, I think, concrete instantiation of this kind of interactive pluralism. Drawing on the long tradition of political pluralism I've outlined above, stretching back all the way to Althusius, Bretherton offers a detailed theological analysis of forms of broad-based community organizing as a kind of consociational politics. Now, important for Bretherton is that these democratic movements, and he in particular is interested in the tradition of organizing known as the Industrial Areas Foundation. Important to him is that, one, these are primarily coalitions of institutions rather than just individuals or what you might think of as issue-oriented movements. These are broad-based, so churches, synagogues, mosques, unions, neighborhood groups, etc., come together in deliberation as institutions rather than just individuals. And two, they're intentionally post-secular in practice. That is, they involve the use of a plurality of religious and moral vocabularies in their work of negotiating a common life together, which is why these are often intensely conflictual democratic practices. But not only are broad-based community organizing networks like the Industrial Areas Foundation political practices of pluralism, they're also, I think Luke rightly sees, covenantal forms of political practice. This is where the two come back together. Noting in the Old Testament, the connection between covenant and assembling, or the gathering of the people of God, Bretherton writes that the assembly, quote, is the means through which to constitute the people as those who stand in covenantal relation to God, to each other, and the rest of creation, end quote. And similarly, by analogy, in practices of broad-based community organizing, the public assembly, which is at the heart of these organizing practices, the public assembly of represented institutions, along with its ritual and even semi-liturgical practices which mark and structure the deliberative practices of the assembly, this is the location in which associations meet and develop covenantal relations of trust and mutuality as they negotiate their various and sometimes competing interests, goods, and visions of flourishing in the pursuit of a common life together. So through practices and rituals of commitment, which is a phrase that Jeff Stout uses in his analysis of these forms of organizing, through these practices, assemblies forge both between their members and between their members and outside political leaders and social bodies, relations of political trust, obligation, and accountability. In the act of assembling, participants dramatically enact peoplehood, the possibility of consensus and collective action amidst difference. And we might note how the increase of political polarization in recent decades has coincided with the rise of certain technological trends in which political discourse becomes increasingly disembodied, captured by social media, corporate media conglomerates, etc. And in this world, practices of assembling, embodied assembling, might be an important corrective. Okay, let me wrap this up and bring this to a close. So I want to close just by raising a question, one which my own work has sought to explore, which is this. What's the place of conflict in all of this, in covenantal pluralism? It's a question that Williams and Bretherton's work raises as they move pluralist theory beyond simply a vision of sovereignty of society's various associations and groups operating relatively autonomously or when together in a kind of orchestrated harmony. But what I want to ask is there something about the conflict between these groups, the arguments and contestations about what is true, what is good, what is just, that is important, even essential to democratic flourishing. I think that there is, in what is hopefully going to be a forthcoming book, I hope in the coming year, which Mark mentioned, Political Theology and the Conflicts of Democracy. I make an extended theological argument that there is, that conflict, even in its most intense forms, can be profoundly productive and generative of social flourishing, and that we should be, in fact, wary of appeals to civic unity and social cohesion and moral colloquy that evade or conceal it, actually. But if conflict is to be productive rather than destructive of flourishing democratic community, then I think covenantal practices like this assembling that I've mentioned provide essential context within which these agonistic negotiations amidst difference can be held and conflict directed to generative ends. Thank you.
An opening question, I think, for both of you. Abigail, you spoke about the way in which there's been I think you said an ineluctable tendency towards homogenization and centralization that have increased polarization in our culture, and proposing the local parish as a kind of alternative model. And similarly, when you were speaking about Figus's vision of a kind of ecclesiology that would contain this pluralism as a living social union exceeding the sum of its parts. That's the kind of vision of the church as a unit that then is able to play a role in this. And I think the question I'm having is it not the fact that our churches are increasingly caught up in this dynamic of delocalization, these same kinds of tendency towards homogenization and centralization are also weakening these units that we would hope would be a way of addressing this. Someone brought up earlier the ways in which churches have become increasingly politically homogenous. We think about the rapid transition to the fact that taking all this stuff online was no big deal back in 2020. And I'm curious about ways in which you think local parishes should be trying to resist these things, or should we, how does this play out in a local parish context, this vision for resistance?
So what does a parish do?
Yeah.
So yes, I do think that there are definitely forces in play that make it hard. It's like swimming upstream. If you try to plant yourself in a certain place, there will be a lot of obstacles, especially if you want to, advance in a specific career. So of course, so a lot of these problems are associated. The mobility has been associated with different socioeconomic groups at different points in time, and now those who are mobile are much more likely to be professional classes. But it's because all of our whatever industry you're in, it's the network is spread very far. So if you want to participate in it, you're gonna have to bounce around from here to there, which, by the way, I'm glad to have met you all. So, so by no means do I say that we should not visit each other across the Anglican Communion, for instance, Bishop. And yet, there's also this, there's a reason that the monastics made vows of stability. And I know people who sometimes do this, and it becomes really countercultural, where they choose, I'm simply committing here, and they make sacrifices of their careers and potential higher earnings. But so that's not something that will be obvious for how we can do this, or our parishes aren't, going to be able to do that collectively. I mean, we'll have people coming and going, but I mentioned a few things that I think that parishes can do in our sense of ourselves. Would start with subtle shifts in the way that we talk about who Christ is even what's happening on the altar sometimes, and what it means to be a congregation. Are we simply a gathering of people who like to get together with each other? Or do we have a missional identity? So it begins with some of those shifts in outlook. But then even I've thought about the liturgical importance of, as I mentioned, the offerings of the people. We don't bring our tithes, of our goat herds or our corn, so it's not as if you will see in the parish, in the doors of the church, a representation of the local economy, unless we make a point of it. At the Diocesan Center in Topeka, you'll see quilts, hanging up there, and stained glass with sheaves of wheat. And I mean, there's a real point of bringing into the church the offerings of the people. And then wouldn't it be interesting? I mean, I've talked so much about the priestly vocation, but for a congregation that doesn't follow parish bounds, isn't it a great opportunity to explicate a lay vocation, to participate in the priestly work of recognizing and naming? No priest can do all of that. Somebody is going to be over here knowing the issues in the public school, and somebody else is going to be over here knowing the issues in the Arts Council, and somebody else is going to be over here recognizing that, hey, there's an immigrant community that we don't interact with. And so you can have members of the congregation coming together and pointing out, I mean, I don't know what the context, the prayers of the people, surely, but probably more context in which we give reports on what's going on in our area. What is our bounded mission field? I mean, boundaries might help, actually, to give a sense of empowerment to actually go out, Anyway, these are certain things but it will be always, I don't think it's ever not going to be swimming upstream.
I can just briefly kind of follow up on that by with two things. One is that I think in the absence of a kind of parish structure, one kind of thing that I've seen that's very hopeful to me is, it's actually more among evangelicals than Anglicans, is the identification with neighborhoods. And particularly in large metropolitan areas. I lived in Chicago for a while, and the sense that a church was a church in a neighborhood, in Albany Park, in Logan Square, was deeply important for a lot of people. It also gave this sense of boundedness, where I remember in church meetings, we would be deliberating about various things, and we would say, that it'd be great to work with that organization, but that's really outside of Albany Park, and we're really called to this neighborhood. And that sense of, not every city is like this, but in Chicago, at least, people are very, very devoted to their neighborhoods, and I found it to work kind of like a parish system in some ways. And the other thing that comes to mind too is something that I find that broad-based community organizing groups do better than churches, but is actually an old practice of the parish, which is walking the parish. Priests literally walking their parish. Groups that I've participated in that do broad-based organizing, walking is an essential part before any campaign. Walking a neighborhood multiple times as a group in public and meeting people and hearing about struggles and the kind of embodied and even affective experience of being in a neighborhood is, I think, really important. I find that Christians don't walk enough. I don't myself. I used to live in Texas, and it was kind of miserable to walk outside. One of my parishioners said, "You should walk the parish more." I said, "It's 108 degrees out. I'm not going to walk around in a cassock." But nevertheless, I think there's something important about walking the parish.
Fascinating. Other questions?
If only we had sidewalks,
Indeed.
which we often lack. Yeah.
Abigail, thank you very much indeed for your talk, which I found particularly interesting, coming as a chairman of a UK-based movement called Save the Parish, which is very focused around so much of what you've been discussing. There is, I suppose, a sad shadow side of what you were discussing now in Britain, which is an increasing movement to obliterate parish boundaries. and to merge parishes together, sometimes for financial reasons, sometimes for ideological reasons. And we're seeing an increasing number of dioceses merging dozens and dozens of parishes into one. And we've just seen this happen in a place called Wigan in the north, where 29 parishes were turned into one, 24 priests reduced to 13, vast spending on £1.2 million spent on resourcing lay ministry at the expense of traditional ministry. And the report came out only 2 weeks ago showing this had resulted in a reduction in the number of people attending church of a third, a reduction in giving by a third, and all the plans that this would in fact rejuvenate and revive the church in the country, and that quite often they looked to other parts of the communion as models for why we don't need small bounded communities but can have parishes of a whole deanery, a whole sort of city. And I think this is being shown not to work at all, and in fact possibly showing the wisdom of small bounded communities. And we're learning this right now to our cost. So that might be, it's more of a reflection, but I wonder if you see that there is actually a limit to how far the boundedness of a parish can actually go.
All right, that makes a lot of sense. So to clarify, you said you are the chaplain of an organization called Save the Parish?
Chairman. I'm the chair of the
chair.
It's a movement that's got seats in General Synod and is sort of campaigning for this.
Well, wonderful. We should have talked earlier, but there we go. Thanks.
Yes, Dr. Terry.
Yeah, thank you very much. I enjoyed both of those papers very much. Can I just ask Nicholas for a bit of a follow-up question? Pluralism and in particular Archbishop Rowan Williams' contribution. It was quite a furore when the idea was Sharia law should be given greater space. Do you think that's an inevitable consequence of his views on pluralism, or was that just a bit of an aberration?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't know that it's inevitable, but it certainly logically makes sense within the English pluralist tradition that he inherits. I take it that part of the controversy was not so much that he was advocating for some forms of religious law being recognized, but that it was Islamic law. And that if he were, at least in the States, if someone were to make a similar type of claim about Christian ecclesiastical law, it would not receive much opposition. So I wonder if it's the peculiarity of it being Islamic law, but it is part of the pluralist vision to recognize certain forms of religious law, not ones that are incompatible with civic law. And that was really, I think, at the heart of the dispute, is what exactly he meant by that. I think he clarified later on a little bit that he was not advocating, forms of Sharia that would kind of like overturn practices of English law, but he was recognizing that there was a plurality that could kind of be properly recognized and give an integrity to the local associations to be able to govern themselves, right, in accordance with state. Yeah, so I think not necessarily a necessary position, but made sense logically within his pluralist philosophy, I think. Yeah.
Other questions?
Thank you. On the topic of constructive conflict, what I find a lot of times when I'm engaged with dialogues with people that from different backgrounds that we may not agree on a lot of things, on a personal level, it can be useful and it can build relationships. But oftentimes there's pushback from others because they say, you're helping, just by talking to them, you're actually helping the enemy, and you give them a little bit of, encouragement, and then when they get in power, they're going to crush us. So, we have because we do have a winner-take-all system for the most part. Not only in politics, even in the church, is a winner-take-all many times. So then, how do these constructive conflicts not lead to a way that, in the end, there's going to be a violent conclusion?
That's great. Thank you. I think, so maybe a couple of things. So one is that I think it's right to acknowledge a limit to who or what positions are worth engaging, and that there is a danger of legitimizing certain positions that are not legitimate simply by having an argument with them. So the thing that fringe, conspiracists and extremists want nothing more is for you to argue with them because it legitimizes their position, right? Publicity is bad publicity. If you're arguing with a flat earther, you're only helping them, right? So I think that it's right to say there are some positions that it's wrong to establish a form of conflictual or argumentative relationship with it because it does authorize it or legitimate it in a certain kind of way. I think those are pretty few, though. Those are the really fringe and dangerous positions. For the person who fears that conversing with an enemy legitimates them, I think I want to say that it seems to come from a kind of fear or anxiety about the own persuasiveness of their own position, and that they would not be able to persuade others of their position if they were put into a contest of competing visions about something. And so I find it to be good for people to be forced to have to argue with seriously contesting positions rather than out of a kind of anxiety of legitimizing them, just ignoring them. I think that makes one's own position weaker, not having to interrogate and argue with those of another. So, I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but...
I guess just to follow up, it's you give them intel, which then they can use in the bigger scheme of things to attack your position.
Yeah, I guess... Do you have maybe an example would be more helpful to think about this in concrete, but I'm not sure exactly what you have in mind. But.
Well, I think getting to like say take abortion. So say I'm a pro-life person, I'm meeting with a pro-choice person, and there's some things we can agree on that would be good, but by sharing those things, then the other side can. They can use that to preempt maybe something that I'm trying to do, or to undermine it, or they could try to co-opt me and tell other people, see, we have our friend here on the other side, he agrees with us, and those kinds of things. It just seems that, especially when everything is so closely divided. Every election is very close, and so just a few votes differently could make a different outcome. Then it seems like everyone is looking how to get an advantage at any way they can, so it makes it hard to build trust.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're getting at now. And it may just be a risk of entering into public exchange, but I do think it's important. When I'm thinking about these sorts of constructive conflicts, I'm thinking about the giving and asking for of public reasons, right? So reasons for one's position that actually should be made widely available as much as possible in order to be scrutinized, challenged, revised, etc. And so I would think that if one really believes in one's position, one should not be afraid of making as public as possible the reasons for that position, even if there is a potential danger in that being misinterpreted or used for for bad faith reasons or something. I think we have an obligation to make public our reasons. And so I think it's worth erring on the side of open exchange rather than kind of closed off exchange. Yeah.
Yes, Peter. Oh, sorry.
Hi, this question's for Abigail. I was touched by your talk, and I was wondering, what link do you make between the decline of the parishes and that organization model and an overall centralization in society and sort of the disempowerment that people feel? There's been an argument recently, and people in America trying to capture more of the Christian democratic subsidiarity spirit, the belief that too much has gone up top and it's created a society of bystanders and people who feel disempowered on the local level. And they've related it back to losses of local control, loss of federalism. And I wonder, to what extent do you think this happened perhaps first in many of our churches may have lost this idea?
So, has centralization happened in churches first and then sort of filtered into society? That's a thesis that I haven't run into. So I mentioned a couple of competing narratives. There'd be one, it's based on a socialist or ideology that leads to centralized management on the part of government. And then another would be, well, it's really about, capitalism that leads to sort of a snowballing effect, which leads to centralized management just in private hands. And a third narrative, and all of these narratives are, you can back them up with empirical evidence, but they're really just an explanatory lens that either resonates or doesn't. Then a third narrative, which is the Alulian approach, is that, well, as soon as you discover, a machine to, clock people into their job, then they have to adapt their own behaviors to the machine, and then other machines have to be invented to respond to this one, and then, and so it's sort of a snowballing effect of efficient technologies and the human behaviors that have to conform to them. And that, for Ellul, is what actually drives the snowball effect. And then, which at the moment, I realize that, again, you could argue with that and say, in this particular case, that was true. In this particular case, maybe it wasn't. But I find that narrative to be a helpful way of pushing back against these more partisan narratives. However, the idea that centralization has happened in the church first is not something that I've encountered. Is there more that you would want to say about that, or who's advocating that?
It's more of a conversation that the church is no longer a model for how to be. That it's more not necessarily that it's happened first, but that it has copied what has happened elsewhere.
Okay. I'm sure so. Yes, that resonates. Not least because, for all kinds of reasons, our congregations have a hard time belonging to each other and belonging to a place. So if you want to try to create that, it's just working against a lot of obstacles. I don't know if I'm addressing exactly the question there. Yeah, thanks.
It is 2:30.
Let's thank our speakers.